Hello, Hokies, and thank you for joining in today's discussion about the future of energy. My name is Quinn Costin, and I will be serving as the moderator for this event. Joining me are representatives from various corners of the energy industry, ready to bring their perspective and experience to the table. So before we kick off the discussion, we'll do a quick round of introductions. My background is in chemical engineering. I graduated from Virginia Tech in 2010 and have been working with ExxonMobil over the past 11 years, but actually on the chemical side of our business. So although I don't work directly in the energy segment, energy is the core of what we do. I'm also very happy to coordinate our alumni and keep our Hokies in touch with each other in our industry, and also to chair our corporate alumni chapter here at ExxonMobil. Now let's introduce our panelists and dive into today's topic. For each of our panelists, please tell us a little bit about your journey, what drew you to work in the energy field, starting with your time at Virginia Tech. Let's start with Daryl.
Afternoon, I'm Daryl Roberts. I am the class of '89 mechanical engineering. I started Virginia Tech in the mid '80s, and one of the things that was ingrained in me back then was the benefit of the co-op program. Working and alternating between semesters, or that back then it was quarters. We were in the quarter system. Shows you how old I am, and I'm surely dating myself here, but. So we alternated between quarters, between working and being in school. And I did the co-op at Virginia Power's North Anna Nuclear Power Station, one of the two nuclear sites located in Virginia. And I did that for about 2 years. And then I finished my degree there at Tech. And upon graduation, we have the Engineering Expo every year. And even as far back as then, we had that going. And several companies were there that had nuclear interests, one of which was the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And they, to me, had the best program for entry-level folks like myself, which included a sort of training internship type thing based at our headquarters in the Washington, D.C. area, specifically Rockville, Maryland, where I am now. And so for the last 32 years, I've been with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and have made my way up from the entry-level ranks all the way up to where I am currently, which is the Deputy Executive Director for Operations out of our headquarters office.
Thank you, Daryl. How about Kathleen? Could you tell us a little bit about what drew you into energy and what your background is?
Pleasure to, and I really appreciate being on the panel today. So I got my master's in information systems in '96 from the Northern Virginia facility. I've actually never even been to Blacksburg, if you can believe it. I was in the information technology sector for over a decade. And then I moved to Denver and wanted to get back into policy. My undergraduate is in political science and defense and arms control studies, which is my entry into as a military intelligence officer in the Army. But I wanted to get back into policy work, so I just did a lot of networking in Denver and networked into the energy industry. And I have been at Western Energy Alliance for about 16 years now. We represent oil and natural gas producers in the Rocky Mountain West.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. We do have to figure out how to get you to Blacksburg at some point, though. So it's a must. So how about David? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you into energy?
Hi, everyone. My name is David Mechanic. I graduated from Virginia Tech with a mechanical engineering degree in 2015. And when I was at Virginia Tech, I got the opportunity to do some undergraduate research in the battery space and in the energy storage space. And it really captivated me. And I loved working with different materials to try to improve energy storage devices. And I got so into it that I decided to, stick around in school for a while. And I went to Stanford to do my PhD in chemical engineering, working on battery technology. I love the technology, and I really think that electrification of everything is important for the clean energy transition. And so I spent my time developing batteries that are safe, higher performance, and that have unique properties that can be used to be structural, impact resistant, flexible, non-flammable, et cetera. And so now I've spun out some of that technology from Stanford, and I'm working on a startup company called Anthro Energy, where we're trying to commercialize the next generation of energy storage devices with all of these unique properties. So that's where I am today, and I'm excited to be exploring new technologies to accelerate the clean energy transition.
Very good. That's an exciting field to be in right now. And last, Dan, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what got you into energy?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me to join the panel. I am class of '97. I got my degree in crop and soil environmental science. Went on to NC State and got a master's in soil science, but I'm a Hokie at heart. I affiliate with VT first and foremost. Did not know what I wanted to do after I received my master's degree, so I applied for a fellowship on Capitol Hill for graduates with science degrees, and ended up, that was in 1999, and I ended up working for a number of different members of Congress on a number of different policy issues over the years, and had an opportunity to work in the George W. Bush White House, where I started to get involved with climate issues. And after that, I've joined the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a trade association with businesses across the economy, and I work on energy regulatory issues, EPA, and handle a lot of our climate work.
Very good. Thank you all very much for those introductions. I mean, again, what speaks to me is just the amount of the industry that we have represented in this panel is really impressive. And so we're really looking forward to hearing your perspectives and what you have to share about your individual fields of expertise. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into a few questions. And let's start with David. So David, based on your area of expertise, what are some common public misconceptions or lesser known benefits dealing with your sector of energy?
That's an interesting question. I think the best perspective I can answer this from is from the perspective of energy storage, which is going to become much more ubiquitous than it is today. And so I think maybe not a misconception, but I think an understanding of what it's going to mean to have something like a battery in your house. So as we create renewable energy sources, we're going to need to have some sort of grid scale storage, but probably also people are going to have storage behind the meter or in their own homes. And so I think people are going to become much more aware of what they use energy for and kind of take into account for what they need to use when. So, do I need to store up energy during the day so I can charge my car at night? Do I give some energy to my neighbor? And this concept of creating kind of a virtual power plant of interconnected batteries that some companies are working on is pretty interesting. And so I think we're going to view energy less of something of, oh, I just need to flip on a switch and it'll happen, to something that we might need to manage a little bit more actively as we transition into this kind of next generation of energy generation and storage. I think I'll end there. I have a couple more thoughts, but that's kind of the surprising thing that I think will happen in the next 10 years.
Very, very interesting. Hey, Daryl, how about you? Anything specific from the nuclear space that may be common public misconception or lesser known benefit?
Well, I think nuclear is sort of the lightning rod when it comes to energy sources. It's very controversial, and people have a lot of unknown fears of it because of the unknowns associated with it. I would say first and foremost that I'm on the NRC side, so we're on the regulatory side of things. So I'll start with that. One common misperception is that the NRC and the Department of Energy are one and the same. We're not. You're two separate entities. The NRC is an independent federal regulator. DOE is more of the proponent of energy sources, and so the two roles are different. And so we often get confused with DOE. So I'll just start with that. But from a technology standpoint, I would offer that I think people believe that they get most of their radiation exposure from nuclear power plants or from living near nuclear power plants, and that's simply not the case. We say this often, if you fly, in an airplane, one flight in an airplane would give you more exposure to radiation than living near a nuclear power plant for a year. Or eating a banana, gives you about as much radiation exposure to radiation as you do from living next to a power plant, a nuclear power plant. In fact, some would argue that even living near a coal plant, on a daily basis, would expose you to more radiation, assuming that, you don't have, an event at a nuclear power plant. So I think that, that's a misperception. I would offer that, the whole image of neutron bomb or the atomic bomb, and the mushroom cloud is a big optic that people have ingrained from the bomb that was dropped 50, 60 something years ago in Hiroshima, and that's just not possible with nuclear power, with commercial nuclear power plants. You're not going to get that effect if there were an accident or a meltdown at a nuclear power plant. Weapons plants or atomic weapons are inherently designed to produce that sort of explosion, that explosive effect, the mushroom cloud and everything else. So you're not going to get that from a nuclear power plant, a commercial nuclear power plant. And I would just offer the biggest myth, I think, is that nuclear is unsafe. I mean, it does have its risks, and they can't be ignored. And that's why we're here, the regulators here, to mitigate that and ensure that the people that are running these plants are mitigating those risks. But as far as its safety record goes, the most significant accident, and I'll knock on wood, that has happened in this country was 3 Mile Island back in 1979. That was 42 years ago. And there have been no deaths recorded from radiological, no radiologically related deaths recorded at nuclear power plants. So its safety record is strong. I'll just use that word. And there's probably many more myths that I could point to, but I'd say that those are probably the biggest ones.
No, thanks so much for sharing that, Daryl. It's a really, really eye-opening type of exposure to that information. So thank you.
No pun intended on exposure, right?
No, definitely not. Absolutely not. Okay, great. So this next question is really a little bit more on the policy side. So I'm going to direct it towards Dan. The US has 3 separate electric grids. Do you see a future where grid unification is a reality?
Thanks, Quentin. I don't, sort of sitting here in DC, you don't hear a lot about that. For those that aren't familiar, we have our 3 grids are the Western Interconnection, Eastern Interconnection, and Texas's ERCOT. And so the divider between the Western and Eastern is really along the Colorado-Wyoming border. So east goes out actually pretty far west, and then Texas is fully contained within Texas. It is true. There's occasionally some talk about this, and certainly the blackouts in Texas earlier this year have got some folks talking about it. But there'd be efficiencies to gain if you combine the grids. Some of it is really it's a historical factor into how the grid was designed. A lot of people don't appreciate that the power grid is really one of the world's largest machines, and it has to operate and ensure when you flip the switch that the lights will come on 24/7, 365. And so I think the bottom line is everyone's looking into the aftermath of what happened in Texas, and you don't hear a lot about grid integration. And I think it would just sort of be costly. There'd be political issues associated with that, in particular Texas, because it has its own isolated grid, is not subject to Federal Energy Regulatory Commission jurisdiction. And as we know, the sort of proud independence of Texans, I think that's something that wouldn't fly to integrate with the rest of the grid there. But I think it does raise issues with kind of the broader story, which is the challenge of grid operations and management planning. And so, for many years, we had a grid that was powered by nuclear, coal, and gas, and they would run base load, and you put a plant in, they run for 40, 50 years. And, it's complicated, but still pretty straightforward. And now what we have is increasing renewables, and there's clearly a transition going on, and sort of balancing the load at all times of the day has become more of a challenge. And that's certainly why storage is so promising, so when the cloud comes in or when the wind stops blowing, those that have to manage the grid have to make sure that they're able to ramp up, and coal and nuclear traditionally have not been able to ramp up very well. So we've been sort of fortunate. I always say gas gas and renewables go together like peanut butter and jelly, because you can ramp gas quickly up and down and help to balance the load. And as we get more renewables on the grid, we're going to need to make sure we balance that. And that's, again, why I think over the long term, you'll see a lot more grid scale energy storage come into balance. So there is a transition underway, but I don't know that grid integration is going to be kind of the first a policy solution to the efficiencies.
Thanks for that perspective, and from my personal point of view, that one's kind of near and dear since you bring up the Texas power grid. I live in Houston, Texas, and so we experienced part of that outage, and we were very fortunate in the overall grand scheme of things. But to that point, given given the recent failure of the grid, what are some of the most important lessons learned from that event?
Yeah, I think the post-mortem is still underway. There was a lot of unfortunate finger pointing immediately after, and I hate using the metaphor perfect storm, but it was in many ways, I think, a perfect storm. So when you just look at the causes of this, first of all, it was a remarkable weather event in terms of the temperatures and the durations of those cold temperatures. You had all these other factors that I think almost every single one ended up kind of going the wrong way. There was human error involved. There was, wind turbines that froze, gas pipelines and valves that froze. It was the beginning of the shoulder season, which is where they had taken some coal and gas offline for seasonal maintenance, because they don't typically have as much demand during that time of year. Texas had shut down 6 gigawatts of coal since 2018, which would have come in handy had they been able to call on it. And then the design of the Texas grid is really unique. So, in Virginia, we have what they call a capacity market, which is essentially insurance. So we pay just a small amount more on our rates to make sure that there's backup power that can be brought online in instances like this. Texas is very laissez-faire, and they do not have a capacity market. So they pay less most of the time for electricity, but when they have a supply-demand imbalance, rates shoot up. And so all of those factors really contributed to what ended up being really a disaster. I think over the long term, you are going to see policy changes where you'll have hardening of both the gas infrastructure and wind power. I mean, there's lots of wind in North Dakota and Minnesota, and you don't hear about it freezing. So it's just a matter of requiring that, and I assume that that's what Texas will do, and there may be some other considerations too. So, but that's probably the biggest lesson learned, is I think to harden the infrastructure.
No, thanks, Dan. I appreciate that, and it's some interesting points you bring up, about natural gas backup. Kathleen, from your perspective, I was wondering if you could chime in and you offer any insights that you may have.
I think that was a pretty good assessment, and I would echo the comment about the finger pointing. That's really unfortunate, and it's a result of the energy as a policy area being so politicized. It's not about what actually works and what's going to be, reliable, affordable. It's about, it's more government interference in the energy markets, and I think that's why we get a lot of distortion in finger pointing. So the weatherization of natural gas infrastructure clearly needs to be done. Obviously, natural gas power doesn't freeze in Chicago, and we continue to produce from North Dakota oil and natural gas wells all throughout the winter. So the weatherization on both ends, but I believe even in North Dakota, wind is not considered, during the winter when it gets below, I don't know, whatever it is, 20 degrees below zero, which is not uncommon in North Dakota. The grid assumes solar and wind are not going to be there. And North Dakota does have quite a bit of wind. So I think it's really unfortunate that we got into a situation of political finger pointing. If you look actually at the numbers, the grid, there was loss of capacity in the grid, and it was fairly evenly spread out over all energy sources if you actually look at the numbers. So the finger pointing is not helpful. It's how do we make Texas's grid more reliable for those, was it a black swan event, or are we going to see really cold weather in Texas every now and again?
No, thank you guys very much for that perspective, and really appreciate it. And again, for me, it's an interesting one to analyze, personally. And I think it's important, like you said, for us to stop the immediate knee-jerk reaction and think through, logically, what are the points that failed, and how can we address it in the future. So let's shift gears a little bit, and let's go to David again. So looking ahead at the not so distant future, is it easy to foresee a world where many consumers have switched to electric vehicles? What are some of the other consumer behavior changes in renewable energy that you expect to be a part of the new normal in the next 20 to 30 years?
That's a pretty interesting and wide spanning question. So I'll probably touch on some of those. I guess starting with electric vehicles, I'm by no means an expert on electrification of the grid for charging infrastructure, but in terms of battery technology, we're definitely going to be there in the next 5 to 10 years, where electric vehicles will become very affordable and I think really widely adopted. You see the growing demand for EVs year over year is just exploding. And so the question is, can we build a charging infrastructure to match the amount of EVs that are coming on the grid? And I think it's possible, but I don't know, probably some of the other people on this call are better to talk about that. But in terms of getting to price parity and being affordable and having an overall lower lifetime cost of ownership, that's right around the corner, and that's really exciting. One issue that I think EVs are going to face is the safety problem. And so in 2020, about 5% of all EVs sold were recalled due to battery fires. And so even though we're getting them cheap and high performance, there still is kind of this glaring safety issue, which hasn't resulted, fortunately, in any or many injuries, but it is something that is, a difficulty for automakers. If you have these problems with the batteries, you have to recall a bunch of vehicles, and we need to figure out a way to fix that. I think other things that might change is, I think in people's homes and their personal lives, we still do power some applications with gas, and basically we have the technology today to replace almost everything in a person's individual life with electricity. So electric heaters and things like that, and electric water heaters. It's all possible right now, and that's going to be necessary if we want to really get to zero emissions and remove gas. Some industrial applications are going to be much harder to switch to electricity, and so that's something that we still need to think about. And then the final thing that I'll say that I personally think will be very interesting in the next decade or so is nutrition and food. And so I think we will start to see a lot of, just in terms of clean energy and emissions, food is really important. So I think we'll see more of these fake meats and lab grown meats and all these things that today seem kind of far-fetched, but I think in the not so distant future will be pretty commonplace in terms of how we eat and how we, get energy to go about our day-to-day lives. So I'm excited for all of those things, and we'll see what happens. And I'm sure there's, people that on this call that have more information or other viewpoints.
Any other panelists that want to chime in?
I wouldn't mind chiming in there. I'm not sure electrification makes sense for everything. If you look at how reliable natural gas is, and you don't have line loss as you do in electricity transmission when you have the direct hookup of natural gas at your house. It's clean burning. Natural gas has replaced fuel switching in the electricity sector from coal to natural gas, has reduced more greenhouse gas emissions over the last 2 decades than wind and solar combined. So certainly, if you look at the fact that 97% of our transportation needs are met through oil and petroleum and natural gas, it's, replacing that all with electricity would be extremely hard to do. The footprint on the land from all the renewables, the footprint of the transmission lines. I mean, it's hard to get anything done in this country, permitting wise, with transmission lines, with siting huge facilities, the land use. So there's a lot of issues that I think need to be worked out before we could get to some kind of electrification of everything. And I would stress that when you look at EVs and the take up in the market, for example, if as David points out, we're near to that point of getting the battery issues fixed and the safety issues, and we could really see that take off, I would suggest that, well, then why do we need a policy from the government that says you will, like as they do in Europe, no more internal combustion engine by X date? that should be something that the market decides based on the actual ability of the market and technology to deliver on a product that people want to buy.
If I could chime in with one other point, and I actually agree with both Kathleen and David, and that's probably part of our chamber's broad membership. We have auto manufacturers, we have oil and gas producers, and we have electric utilities. But this is just top of mind because we filed comments on this earlier this week, and that is, the President Biden has issued an executive order looking at supply chain. So we're all sensitive to supply chain now because of the pandemic, and it's really popped up in all sorts of areas. But in particular, they're looking at electric vehicle battery supply chain. And so right now, electric vehicles compared to an internal combustion engine will use about 4 times the copper. They rely on cobalt, which is really that supply chain is completely controlled by China, lithium, nickel, et cetera. And so it's funny because, not funny, but it's important because, for years, the US was not energy independent, and you heard a lot about our dependence on foreign nations for energy. And of course, that's been solved by fracking and shale gas for the most part. But now we have, as we think about a future with EVs, we've got the situation where we're extremely dependent on China for the entire supply chain for these inputs to EVs. And so hopefully there'll be a lot of work and focus on that on both the mining side. I mean, you have to understand, we want to build electric vehicles, we're going to have to accept mining. To Kathleen's point on the controversy for getting permits, it's very difficult to permit a copper mine in the United States. You just can't do it. And so we're going to have to make some tough decisions in order to get our have energy security as it comes to the future with EVs.
Thank you guys very much for chiming in, and really appreciate you bringing these to the surface. As you can imagine, it's a very complex and multifaceted type of issue. So I appreciate you guys bringing some of these things to the surface. Let's switch over a little bit to back to Daryl and talk about nuclear. So how could the expansion of nuclear, for instance, help us curb carbon emissions and meet environmental goals? And what are, if any, some of the major trade-offs?
Well, let me put this disclaimer out there first, because as I mentioned earlier, the NRC is a regulator, and so we're not positioned to promote any energy source, and nuclear certainly would not be one that we would promote given our regulatory oversight role. But I think it's, just from an independent observer's perspective, US citizen, watching the tea leaves here or reading the tea leaves, I believe that there has been this more bipartisan sort of support for nuclear over the last decade or so, or, a couple of decades. There used to be this sort of Republican and Democrat divide between, the support for nuclear. And I think that with, as was mentioned earlier, President Biden has issued not only that executive order on supply chain, but he also issued an order or an edict, I'll call it, on modernizing the infrastructure, creating jobs, and expanding on the use of the green energy sources, or the clean energy sources, nuclear being one of those. And he's specifically included nuclear in this recent edict that was issued. And so that's something that you might not have seen that 20 so years ago from a Democratic president. So I would offer there, from my independent observation perspective, I think that there's just been there's been a recognition that nuclear can contribute to a cleaner, carbon-free environment. And this president has made it clear that that's part of his agenda. I would offer that, the NRC's role is basically to review and approve and, ultimately regulate whatever nuclear energy source is presented to us, for the purpose of our oversight function. So if the country's energy policy is such that nuclear is going to continue to be a part of that, then our role is to ensure that that is done in a safe and compliant manner with our regulations.
Given the interest in the uptick recently, do you think that there's a future, and in the context of the regulatory environment, do you think there's a chance that the future nuclear reactors look different than they do today?
Oh, yeah. I would offer yes. And I think Dan touched on this a little bit earlier in his discussion about the base load and the current fleet of large reactors, large energy generators like nuclear plants and coal plants, which were basically built, many decades ago or designed decades ago to support this sort of base load, grid concept, where you just have large generators sitting there generating, large amounts of electricity. I think what the nuclear industry has recognized in recent years, maybe decades at this point, is that you're going to have to be able to compete with the wind and the solar and these other smaller, types of generators that are more load following, that can react to demand changes on the grid, and be able to, shut down and ramp up quickly to support those changes in demand. Also, I think there's always been a desire for nuclear to make it safer, inherently by design, and so you have safer fuel sources, fuel designs. There are advanced reactor designs that are out there now that people are exploring and have been exploring for decades, but there seems to be more energy around that these days. Some designs have been proposed, at least in discussion, at the discussion phase, but also I think we've received some letters of intent regarding applications for some design certifications for certain types of advanced reactors. And so you're going to see some changes from the large light water reactor designs that have been the predominant source of nuclear power for the last 5 or 6 decades in this country.
No, very interesting, and thanks for sharing that with us. One more kind of segueing just a little bit, on the concept of carbon. So for Kathleen, so given our current, given the current global context, heightened pressure to decarbonize, obviously just the geopolitical influences over that area and other challenges, or what are the other challenges to future oil and gas? Do you think the industry is going to need to reinvent itself? And if so, how do you think this might impact everyday life?
Well, we're constantly reinventing ourselves. I mean, we just delivered a decade of absolute energy revolution. We became the #1 oil and natural gas producer in the world in just a few years ago because of, as Dan mentioned, advances in hydraulic fracturing combined with horizontal drilling. So we've delivered safe energy that is environmentally responsible, and we will continue to do that. Companies are constantly innovating to make sure we reduce our environmental footprint on the land and on air emissions, et cetera. So we constantly do innovate. Many of the larger companies are certainly looking at ways to reduce emissions or get to net zero. And Quentin, you'd know more about that than I, being at Exxon. But I represent smaller independents, so there's different levels in the industry. But in general, our industry has put a lot of investment into wind and solar and algae and other types of potential alternative energies. So yes, I think we will need to continue to reduce our emissions and continue to help in the decarbonization. As I mentioned earlier, fuel switching to natural gas has delivered a very significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector. But the reality is, any reliable projection on the fuel mix out to 2050 shows oil and natural gas pretty much at about the same level as they are today, because as global demand for energy increases, yes, wind and solar will increase, but so will the need for natural gas, oil, and coal. I think it's crazy that we're not doing more nuclear. I mean, it's totally carbon free, it's base load, it's very energy dense, so it doesn't take up the footprint on the land. I know Daryl doesn't want to promote it, but I'll promote it, even though I don't represent any nuclear companies at all. I mean, you can have base load nuclear. We should be increasing nuclear because it's completely carbon free and it is safe. I mean, there's that misperception. So I won't ramble on too much on this, but constant innovation, and we're proud that we've met every legitimate environmental challenge, and we're working to reduce those methane emissions as well, and having great success over several decades now.
If it's okay, I'll just chime in quick because I spend an awful lot of time on this and completely agree with Kathleen, and would also just big shout out for nuclear. Nuclear is Rodney Dangerfield doesn't get the respect it deserves. I just saw an article in New York Times recently. They're closing the Indian Point nuclear reactor that has served New York City for decades. They're going to replace it with gas. Nothing against gas, but that's going to increase emissions. And so there's kind of a strange part of our debate on climate where nuclear does not get the attention it deserves as part of the solution. But the other point I wanted to make, since I spend so much of my time on climate policy, is we make a little bit of a mistake here in the US where we kind of talk about US climate policy as if the United States is the planet, and it's not. And we emit about 5 gigatons of CO2 each year. There's 35 gigatons globally. And because you still have 800 million people around the world that don't even have access to electricity and are trying to increase living standards in India and China and Africa and elsewhere, the world is, to Kathleen's point, is just we're going to need all sources, and we wanted to make them as clean as possible. And we hope we can have really cheap nuclear and really cheap CCS so that when Africa electrifies, they'll be able to use that. But just focusing on the US here alone is not necessarily going to solve the emissions problem. So we need every tool in the toolbox.
And thanks, Dan, for bringing us into that whole global context. It's a very dynamic, global environment with respect to energy, and so it's one of those things that it's very difficult for us to break out of our local context. And so, thank you for bringing that point to the conversation. So we're running out of time, and in closing, I'd like to go around the table one more time and get your final thoughts on one key takeaway that you hope that Hokies gain from this conversation on the future of energy. So. With that, let's start with David.
Yeah, I think this has been a really great conversation, and I think one takeaway that I've had, and I hope others do as well, is that people like me that are kind of heads down in the weeds of the technology, it's important to look at the broader picture. And so I think I talked about EVs, we have the technology there, but a lot of the stuff that's going on the grid, it's really challenging, and we're not necessarily there yet if we want to get to quote zero emissions. And so I think it's important to obviously work on the technology, but also I hope that people were able to take a broader context of how this technology will fit into the larger picture, which no technology alone can solve all of these issues with clean energy transition.
Great, thank you, David. Daryl, why don't we go to you?
Yeah, I would just offer that I want to give kudos to Virginia Tech and its continued investment in nuclear curriculum and education. When I was at Virginia Tech in the mid 80s, the reactor there, the research reactor we had, was decommissioned in 1985, like within a year of my arrival there. And so I had to get all of my nuclear exposure, for lack of a better word, through textbook coursework and things like that, without really being able to get into some of the more hands-on type experiences. But I want to applaud Virginia Tech for its cooperation with other schools, for its continued alignment with with companies that are researching and developing these new technologies that are being explored and discussed with the agency. Virginia Tech continues to play a key role in that, and so the school is very important to this discussion into the future of the energy.
Great. Kathleen, any closing thoughts?
I would echo the emphasis on technology. Technological innovation solves so many different problems, and it's best left to the engineers and the scientists. and kept away from the policymakers. Because there's one thing about policy, it always has unintended consequences. It's always, it just is not as effective as policy should follow technology. Policy shouldn't dictate technology. So that's what we're seeing today. That's why we have issues with grid reliability in California and Texas. And so let the engineers rule and not the policymakers.
Very good. And last but not least, Dan, you mind giving us some closing thoughts?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll echo Daryl and thanks Virginia Tech for putting this on. As you can see by my man cave behind me, I have a lot of pride. I love everything about the school. I'm trying to brainwash my kids currently into attending, so hopefully that goes well. But in terms of energy, I think maybe one key takeaway for me is we have to recognize, kind of get beyond maybe the headlines and the political battles that you see in DC, and realize that there's a lot of reason for optimism. Every energy source has trade-offs. We're making a lot of progress on emissions reductions. There's a lot of promising technologies on the horizon. I think we're going to get it right. So this notion of pessimism when it comes to energy and environmental issues, I certainly don't share and don't think others should either.
No, that's perfect. And I'll offer one more closing thought. And for me, it's really about people. And this panel is a really good representation of that. It's about scientists and engineers and folks in information technology and business, et cetera, that are all working hard to make a difference and do the right thing. And I know in my experience with the Hokies that I've worked with, both in my company and in others, there are a lot of really smart people out there that are trying to contribute and want to contribute and do the right thing. So with that, I'll say, thank you all for a very good, diverse discussion today. I think a lot of topics were covered. Obviously bringing in expertise from around the energy industry is really important. And I think this was a very valuable conversation to have. So thank you all. And I'll close with 2 words: go Hokies.